Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen. Whenever I find myself getting too mired in ongoing fantasy or sci-fi series as a reader, I take the chance to occasionally check into my lengthy list of horror recommendations from friends and colleagues, select one out, and settle in for a good break in said series. As I've gotten older, I find it also right next door to impossible to concentrate on more than one book at a time, which has the drawback of tunnel vision in its own way, but it also has the advantage of focus. That focus is especially helpful for review and analysis, which I bring you here today once again. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T Calkins-Treworgy, also known in various places online as Byron Residius. Today, this is going to present to you, or I'm going to present to you, a review of Greg F. Gifune's 2008 novella, The Judas Goat. Turn off the display on my handy dandy Kindle. Let's get into a brief synopsis and then do a sectional breakdown as per my usual review or analysis videos. The majority of this review analysis will be kept spoiler free, but at around the 3/4 of the way through this video mark, I will include a section that does have spoilers, that explains a fierce objection that I had with the work right near the last, I'd say 10% of the book, which I fully admit colors my overall reaction to the work as a whole in retrospect. I'll warn you when that section is coming, however. Synopsis, reading from my handy-dandy review notebook. Lenny Cates had a dream once, when he was young, of being a successful actor. He even went to college at 19 and took a year of classes in drama and theater arts, but dropped out afterwards and moved to New York City after 1 year to try and make it happen. Like most aspiring artist types, though, he settled into a low-stakes job in the city as a hotel overnight clerk, got together with another dreamer type, Tabitha, once an aspiring figure skater whose endeavors were undercut by a career-ending injury, and sort of staggered through life in a haze of half-hearted efforts on all fronts. Nearly 20 years after dropping out of college, his fortunes take an odd turn when he is contacted by an attorney out of the small town of Trappers Woods in New Hampshire. This attorney tells him that Sheena, a short-lived but intense flame from that 1 year of college, has passed away and has left him the cottage that she owned on the outskirts of town. Lenny is asked to go to the property and decide what to do with it, and while there, he becomes enmeshed in an odd, otherworldly mystery surrounding this former paramour of his and what led to her curious demise. Now, that's just a brief, kind of detail-free synopsis or teaser to get you interested in the story itself. Now let's go through the sectional breakdown. Characters. 6 out of 10. Whenever a reader is engaging with a short story or novella, there's not going to be a ton of cast members to contend with of great depth, often due to the length of the work. And this results in focusing in on one or two central characters. Lenny's tale aims squarely at him, and Greg Gifune's efforts to give us a solid look at this primary protagonist pay off pretty well as a result. Lenny comes through as a quite well-built person, though he is clearly a man haunted by his failures in the art of acting and in his failures in relationships. Lenny is revealed in the flashback sections of the story to to be a deeply selfish and overly idealistic kind of guy. But there's no ambiguity about his being a fully realized person and character. He's fully fleshed out. You don't have to like a character to appreciate when they're well written. Likewise, Sheena is quite well presented in the form of flashbacks and conversations about her when she was alive. Both she and Lenny are solidly presented. Every other character in the work, however, ends up feeling a little wooden or stereotypical, however, which does take away some from the overall rating in this category. Even Gus Govich, in whom there was potential for a fairly interesting character, ended up being little more than a sort of archetype straw man as a result. Plot, 7 out of 10. Trying to pigeonhole Gifune's Judas Goat as either a ghost story or a paranormal dread tale doesn't work very well, because at its core, it's a little bit of both. Sorry. Gifune's tale is not terribly long, and there are elements that will feel well familiar to horror veterans. Lenny's memories of his brief time with Sheena collide with his desire to figure out what happened to her in the oddly quiet town of Trapper's Woods, resulting in a pretty compelling story that makes the reader just as curious as Lenny himself. Overall, it results in a fairly intriguing and compelling narrative. World-building mechanics, 5 out of 10. The flashback sequences, while illustrative of character, are somewhat heavy-handed in Judas Goat, and don't end up really contributing to how the current-day plot events function. Initially, Gifune's vagaries about the story's supernatural elements lands an almost Lovecraftian aura to the tale, which works wonderfully. Sadly, he eventually infuses a degree of mechanical explanation, or an attempt thereof, which, because he doesn't go into enough detail, ends up merely coming across as a sort of half-assed or half-hearted explanation, rather than being interesting and occult. Narrative technique, 9 out of 10. This cannot be overstated because a lot of authors in the modern era of horror absolutely muck this up. Gifune has mastered the practice of balancing detail with implication or generalization. Where many authors may over-rely on gory and grim particulars, he gives a flash look with hints and peeks and implications. When sex pops up in the story, as happens in a lot of horror, I've talked about that before, it isn't crudely or graphically obscene in details, but it also doesn't shy away entirely. Environments and characters end up getting the same treatment, and it is handled superbly by Gifune, keeping readers centered in the scene that they're currently in without being overbearing. This is a challenge in stories of this length, and frankly, he nails it in Judas Goat. Pacing, 8 out of 10. Gifune's Judas Goat is definitely a novella in terms of overall length, and he wastes no time getting readers into the characters and events of the plot. His balance of flashbacks and current events comes across as markedly skilled, and I imagine this came at the expense of a lot of gnashing of teeth as he probably edited down to this tight and powerfully framed little story. Conclusion. On a mathematical average level, this story is a 7 out of 10. Judas Goat ends up being a solid read, and if you've never read anything by Greg Gifune before, as I hadn't, this work makes a strong case for him as a premier and as a talent in the genre to track down and keep reading from. Tightly paced and well told, Judas Goat makes for a perfect supernatural mystery to delve into for a short time. Just don't expect to necessarily like Lenny Cates by the time the story is over. And remember that Gifune nails this aspect of the art of the written word, and I mentioned it a little bit before. A well-written character does not have to be likable for us to recognize that they're well crafted. For horror fans, I would definitely recommend at least a borrow or loan of Judas Goat, if you can find it. And if you can find a cheap copy, as I did, in ebook format on sale for $10 or less, I'd say go ahead and give it a pick up and read, particularly if you're a fan of horror or the supernatural. Now, if that's all you're looking for is a review, go ahead and click away from the video. I appreciate you stopping in and for sticking around for that much of the analysis and review. Because we're about to get into spoiler-heavy territory. And I'm going to explain here why I personally lost a lot of my enjoyment for this work in retrospect in the long run. This is territory that relies on my personal moral and ethical compass, my biases as a person. And this should be skipped or ignored if you're looking to avoid those sorts of things influencing your decision to borrow or buy this book to read for yourself. If it's going to influence your ability to enjoy it, I would, again, take this with a dose of salt. If you're still here, you've been warned. To begin with, when I mentioned before that the flashbacks served well to establish the character of Sheena, I meant every bit of that. What I did not get into, however, was a pivotal flashback sequence, one that comes in at around the 80 to 85% of the way through the story mark. And that's another part of the reason why this hit me really hard, because I was really enjoying the story up to this point, and this flashback sequence really irked me. Throughout Lenny's flashback looks at his and Sheena's fiery relationship, he persistently insists at that time, during that time in his youth, that he wasn't looking for a serious relationship. Sheena seemed okay with this, but as time went on, she started to prod for something more in each subsequent flashback that was moving forward. On a fateful trip after they finish their freshman year of college together, the pair get into an argument in an oceanfront hotel room, and Lenny goes for a walk to catch some air and think things over. During this argument, she conveyed to him that she might have gone off of her birth control. Eventually, Sheena joins him outside, wrapped only in a hotel blanket. It turns out that she took his mescaline and drank several beers to deal with staring the end of their relationship in the face. And in a chemically altered fit of free spirit, she leads him on a teasing chase to the beach nearby, where they stumble upon a trio of roughneck bikers. The bikers like what they see. Sheena, in a play at trying to make Lenny jealous or reconsider his decision to stay casual and end their relationship, ends up leading the bikers from the fire, one at a time, over toward their bikes, a little bit away, and she ends up giving them each a blowjob, right in plain view of Lenny, who just holds this closed beer that the bikers had handed him. When Sheena comes back toward Lenny, after servicing this trio, he tries to convince her to go back to the hotel with him, that they don't want any trouble. And he says he wants to talk things over with her. But the lead biker then kind of turns to him and threatens him. Tells him flat out, quote, "We're gonna run a train on your horny little bitch here now, buddy." And Lenny sees in Sheena's eyes, just past this guy's shoulder, absolute terror, fear, recognition that she has been playing with fire here, and a desire to get out of the situation that has now grown worse. And though he considers for a moment using this closed, thus compact can of beer to start a fight or bash this guy in the head to try and save her, in the end he ends up doing a mental calculus that the three of them are going to brutalize and possibly kill him if he takes a swing. So what does Lenny do? He walks away, leaving her to her fate. She does eventually come back to him several hours later when he's standing outside smoking near the hotel. And they go into the room without a word between them. They leave the next morning and he drives her home. Not a word exchanged between them for several hours. Current day Lenny learns that Sheena had had an abortion, though it is never confirmed if the pregnancy was from him or from the bikers. Still, Lenny carries the guilt, though she may have lied to him about being on birth control, so that's all up in the air. It's unknown. It's left unanswered. There's no denying that Sheena was victimized here. Likewise, there's no denying that Lenny was and continued to be a selfish prick. However, from the narrative framing and the way Lenny accepts his horrific supernatural end, a kind of vengeance from beyond the grave by Sheena, Gifune's story seems to lay the blame entirely at Lenny's feet, which, for my liking, is not justified. She lied to him about being on birth control. She nudged him constantly for commitment that he said up front he was never looking for. She got drunk and high and tried to use sex to cuckold and punish him for not giving her what she wanted, when she wanted it, which resulted in her being victimized and seeming to blame him for not coming to rescue her from her own piss-poor decisions. Weirdly, all of this kind of plays well with the concept of the Judas Goat, which is an animal, usually a goat, that is trained to befriend cattle and sheep and eventually guide them up into the slaughterhouse to meet their doom. Gifune poses the question of who the Judas Goat is in this story, but the answer is glaringly obvious to me, and that it is Sheena. Yet, in typical modern standards fashion, Gifune seems to narratively throw Lenny under the bus, even though readers can see how Sheena nudges and manipulates throughout the flashbacks. That's my personal issue with this tale, and why I ended up losing some of my enjoyment of it in retrospect. I could be reading too much into all of that, or assigning intention to Gifune that wasn't actually there. But given the way that most of the publishing industry seems to be trending, can you blame me for thinking that's what he was getting at? I'm not sure. Anyhow, that's all for now, ladies and gentlemen. Again, take the second half of this video with a grain of salt, because it is my own personal interpretation. And that should not necessarily deny you from enjoying what is otherwise a very well put together story. It is well written. I can't deny that. But again, there's things that come in right at the very tail end of the story that kind of, I don't know, kick me in the shins a little. There's also a denouement at the end of the story after Lenny has finished his business. There's a denouement that really didn't need to be there. Kind of felt like it would have been a better ending to the story if it had finished after Lenny's part in the story was completely done. Would have left things a little bit more vague and uncertain, which for this kind of horror story actually works to its benefit. Having the denouement felt like extra padding that ultimately did not serve the actual quality of the story. Anyhow, thanks for tuning in, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.